The PS5 Pro, aka Project Trinity, has been leaked. Kinda. We don't know what it's gonna look like yet, what it's gonna cost, or how Sony are gonna convince console gamers it's worth the upgrade. What we do have is a pretty good idea of what the new GPU is gonna be like, and, to a certain kind of nerd, it already looks sort of familiar. The new GPU in the PS5 Pro hasn't been fully revealed, but we do have enough detail to make an educated guess. According to the leaks, which originated with Moore's Law is dead, but have been confirmed and elaborated on by Digital Foundry, it's going to have 60 compute units with 33.5 teraflops of FP32 performance, up from the 36 CUs of the original PS5. AMD, the company who makes the PlayStation CPUs and GPUs, has a couple of readily available Radeons with 60 compute units already, so it should be possible right now to get an idea of what gaming performance on the PS5 Pro will be like, what benefits console gamers will get from this new GPU, and, for us PC gamers, what kind of performance a PS5 Pro Console Killer will have to aim for. First though, we need to figure out which Radeon GPU is closest. The original PS5 Oberon GPU is based on RDNA 2, or possibly a hybrid of RDNA 1 and 2 depending on who you ask. 33.5 teraflops is a ridiculous number to expect from an RDNA 1 or 2 GPU. An RX 6800, which is the consumer 60 CU card based on RDNA 2 architecture, puts out just over 16 teraflops at about 2.1 GHz. 33.5 teraflops would require a clock speed of 4.3 GHz. Your PS5 Pro's exhaust would be hot enough to melt steel beams. The RX 7800 XT is a much more realistic candidate, as its RDNA 3 architecture with dual-issue FP32 shader units can reach more than 37 teraflops at just over 2.4 GHz. Underclocking this card to 2.2 should be all that's needed to hit the necessary floppage, and that's exactly what I'm going to do in this video. My particular model is the Asus Dual OC version, which at stock is a fairly thirsty card, with a 263W TDP that's more than a base PS5 consumes all by itself. I don't have any other models of this card to compare it to, but my short, two-sentence review of this one is, it's a good performer. It seems to reach its target clocks with no problems, and runs fairly cool and quiet. It's quiet, but not dead quiet, however. The card does suffer from a bit of coil whine. Underclocking is simply a matter of dragging sliders. I could use the Radeon software to achieve this, but as I'm using MSI Afterburner for counting frames, I'm going to use its clock speed tools as well. Regardless of how I choose to change the clocks, the card takes it as a suggestion rather than an order. Dialing in a clock speed of 2.18 GHz sees it creep as high as 2.3, so after some experimenting, I settled on 2.13, which often sits at the desired 2.18, but still drifts up to 2.2 or higher whenever it feels like it. The new GPU is, of course, not the only thing that makes the console Pro. It has the same 16 gigs of unified memory as the previous version, but VRAM allocation is extended to over 13 gigabytes, and memory bandwidth is increased from 448 gigs a second to 576. This is harder to compare to PCs, as most consumer desktops don't use unified memory. The RX 7800 XT has dedicated GDDR6 VRAM running at 624GB a second, but the DDR5 6000 I use for system memory on my test rig only transfers at 48GB a second, and the whole thing's complicated further by the graphics card's use of Infinity Cache. Because I can't really control for any of this, I'm just going to ignore memory clocks for this test. If anyone asks, I'll just point out that the VRAM bandwidth minus the system RAM bandwidth is also 576 gigs a second. And hope no one asks any follow-up questions. There are other things we know about the PS5 Pro thanks to the leak that I can't account for in this test. It's reported to have neural processing units capable of 300 TOPS of AI processing, which might be related to Sony's new proprietary upscaling tech. There's also the CPU, which is probably not going to be an architectural upgrade over the original Zen 2 chip, and will only have an optional 10% clock speed boost to differentiate it from the old version. I will be testing with a 6-core Ryzen 5 7500F, based on the far more powerful Zen 4 architecture and clocked to over 5 GHz. This could potentially make this fake PS5 Pro GPU look better than it will in the final finished product, but it's worth remembering that most games on the 9th gen consoles run at 30 or 60 FPS, so I'm not going to be looking at the PS5 Pro's potential as a high frame rate monster. There's also the part of the leak that says RT performance will see between 2 and 3 times performance uplift over base PS5, potentially up to 4 times in some scenarios. Now, AMD's ray tracing performance is derived from the number of TMUs, which the PS5 Pro will have 67% more of, so that alone accounts for a substantial uplift over PS5. The step up from RDNA 2 to RDNA 3 in terms of ray tracing performance per compute unit isn't something I have data for, but I know it's not much, and it's certainly not going to explain a 3x improvement over the PS5, much less 4x. It's been suggested that this might be a sign the PS5 Pro will have at least some elements of the forthcoming RDNA 4, as those GPUs aren't expected to release until around the same time as the new console. All I can do for now is test with what I have. Well, that's enough chit-chat about teraflops and gigabytes. Let's see some... The PC version of The Last of Us has no original quality preset, as in some past PlayStation ports. However, Reddit user Lamby79 has put together an exhaustive list of quality settings they believe matches the console version, and these are the ones I've used for this test. In fidelity mode, the base console has a 30 FPS target, but can drop below that in more demanding situations. In performance mode, that target climbs to 60, while dropping resolution to 1440p, with neither mode apparently using checkerboard rendering or dynamic scaling. The RX 7800 XT, at PS5 Pro equivalent clock speeds, completes my test scene at full 4K with an average of about 55 FPS, with lows in the mid-40s. This is just short of offering a 4K 60 output that would effectively replace both fidelity and performance modes, and it wouldn't take much upscaling to get it to hit the targets. But that would mean the PS5 Pro enhanced experience was slightly lower fidelity than the original PS5, and that would be a bit weird. Perhaps instead of using the extra power of the PS5 Pro to increase the frame rates, Naughty Dog will leverage the new GPU to introduce ray tracing, making the next new version a remaster of a remake of a remaster of a 2013 game. Resident Evil 4's original 9th gen console version has something of a mishmash of performance modes, and I don't have the time or inclination to test them all. From what I can tell, the PS5 Pro would have enough grunt to make most of them obsolete anyway. The underclocked 7800 XT can drive a full 2160p image at max settings, including ray tracing at an average of 62 FPS with lows of 50. Obviously, there'd be some level of optimization, as console games rarely, if ever, run at close to a PC's maximum settings, so I think Capcom should have no trouble making a rock-solid, zero-compromise mode for RE4 Remake, covering both hair strands and ray tracing, and all at a smooth 4K 60 FPS. Horizon Forbidden West's PC port is brand new, released just a few days before I started benchmarking, and so I wasn't able to find any confirmation of what equivalent quality settings it uses when compared to the PS5 original. To cover my bases then, I repeated my benchmark tests at native 4K with 3 quality presets: medium, high, and very high. Assuming the estimated 45% performance uplift from the Pro leak is accurate, then I'd guess that the console version uses a mix of high and very high, as they come in at averages of 49 and 44 FPS respectively. Medium comes close to 60 but doesn't quite hit it, so I think the most likely scenario is that Sony will apply their new PSSR upscaling to sell this as a 4K 60 experience. The latest PC port of an Insomniac game, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, uses DRS in every mode, so it's never truly outputting a full 4K image 100% of the time. That makes things easier when it comes to selling a 4K 60 mode, especially when, as far as I can tell, the PS5 Pro will only be able to achieve just under 50 FPS without it. Digital Foundry provided the equivalent quality settings, and at 4K with RT reflections, the Faux Pro GPU... Damn, why didn't I come with that nickname earlier? The Faux Pro averages 47 FPS with lows of 38. Enabling DRS achieves a virtually locked 60 at these settings with few performance issues, so I can see this being the way they'd go. Though I assume they'll use PSSR upscaling rather than the XeSSR used, which made a bit of a mess of some of the surfaces. I was curious about the possibility of an upgraded Fidelity RT mode with added shadows, as it was something the Sony memo expressly suggested to developers. However, RDNA 3 ray tracing falls a long way short of the target here, failing to hit a cinematic 24 FPS average and with a metric buttload of stutter. If the PS5 Pro does have RDNA 4 ray tracing, it had better be at least 50% better than this. Every PC gamer's current favourite PlayStation game, Helldivers 2 is curiously demanding on the hardware. From what I hear from DF's coverage, the quality mode renders at a mere 1728p and performance mode at just 1080p. The PS5 Pro will, if my estimations are correct, be able to run quality mode at full 4K and performance mode at about 1440p. The problem is, I don't know how you spin that as a marketing person. Most devs aren't that forthcoming about what resolution their console games run at, so it takes outlets like Digital Foundry to sit and actually count pixels to find this stuff out. So, when the PS5 Pro launches and someone at Sony writes the copy for the enhanced version of Helldivers 2, will they come clean and say, no, it wasn't 4K before, but it is now? Or will it be on spectral super resolution to save the day? The original PS5's quality mode for Alan Wake 2 changes resolution dynamically from between 1270p and 2160p in order to hit the 30 FPS target, and all I can really say for the PS5 Pro version is that it will probably stick closer to the native 4K mark. Locked at 2160p and high settings, the game almost manages a constant 30 FPS, with drops to around 25. So some settings optimization is probably all that's needed to reach the targets. Again, it probably doesn't help to sell consoles to say that your old one wasn't really 4K but your new one is. So I think 4K 60 is a more likely point to hone in on. The original performance mode would scale down as low as 847p and maxed out at 1440p. Whereas it's possible to hit a 4K 60 average in the high preset using balanced FSR. So, in that regard, I think the PS5 Pro version will at least look much better. I like to think they'll have enough horsepower to enable at least a modest amount of ray tracing. However, unless Sony really do have some magic up their sleeves, there's not much chance that console owners will get to experience Alan Wake 2 with path tracing. Likewise, path-traced Cyberpunk might not be on the cards for the PS5 Pro, but ray tracing could see a healthy upgrade. Currently, on PS5, the quality RT mode only has local shadows and renders at 1440p upscaled to 4K. With the Faux Pro GPU, those same settings render at 42 FPS on average, and while it might be reasonable to expect the RDNA 4 ray tracing to hit 60 at these settings, it would still be with a bare minimum of RT effects. However, there might be room to add some more ray tracing effects without sacrificing that 30 FPS experience. I was able to add RT reflections to the regular local shadows and still maintain 36 FPS with lows of 30. So, perhaps the PS5 Pro enhanced experience will remain at 30 FPS just with better quality ray tracing. As for performance mode, the original console upscaled to 1800p from between 1008 and 1440p in order to hit the 60fps targets. The Faux Pro can do that at 1800p high without any upscaling, so either they'll opt for a 4K performance mode upscaled from 1440p, or they'll stick with 1800 with some optimizations. That's pretty much all the relevant PS5 titles I had to test. Dragon's Dogma 2 was on my list, but it looks like it's yet another piss-poor PC port that will absolutely be limited by the CPU, and I didn't have time to wait for a patch. Still, out of curiosity, I ran the 7800 XT through my usual benchmarking gauntlet at both stock and underclocked settings, including a few titles that aren't available on PlayStation. All you insecure folks get to see how your current GPU measures up to the hypothetical PS5 Pro, and everyone else gets to enjoy a bit of Midnight Racer by backing track. For those of you thinking of putting together a PS5 Pro Killer, the options are looking fairly slim. With the underclock applied, the RX 7800 XT loses an average of 8.7% performance compared to stock, meaning the closest GPU is probably the original RTX 4070. This would make a pretty good candidate, as it already has its own hardware-accelerated upscaling tech in the form of DLSS, and while its 12GB of VRAM is a little below the 13 to 14 expected to be usable by the PS5 Pro, Nvidia's texture compression usually means games don't use quite as much VRAM when compared to AMD-based hardware. There aren't many older candidates, with the closest being the OG RTX 3080, which I'd normally suggest skipping in favour of the 12GB version or the 3080 Ti due to VRAM constraints, but the standard 10GB model could do the job if you're happy making some compromises. On the AMD front, the obvious choices are the RX 6800 XT and 6900 XT, the latter of which will get its own review in a few weeks' time. And if you can pick up either of these for a substantial discount below the 7800 XT, then they certainly are of console killer quality. These are all pretty expensive options. The cheapest of these PS5 Pro Killer GPUs is probably somewhere in the $400 or pound range, and while I personally expect the new console to cost at least $700 at launch, it's still a lot to ask. Older GPUs are unfortunately mostly too weak or have too little VRAM to go toe-to-toe with a 60 compute unit RDNA 3 GPU. However, if you're not against the idea of going a little harder with DLSS, perhaps the RTX 2080 Ti could be a good console killer candidate, especially as it's now available for less than £300 used. I have a review of that card coming up next week, if all goes to plan. It might not be a perfect match, but I think I'm pretty close with the underclocked 7800 XT, aka the Faux Pro. The benchmarks show most games seem to benefit from about a 50% uplift in performance from the base console, which is roughly in line with what the leak suggested. This isn't enough to get any game from 4K 30 to 4K 60 alone, so I suspect PSSR, PlayStation's Spectral Super Resolution, is going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to upgrading existing titles to the new Pro platform. I haven't talked much about high frame rate modes, and that's because I don't think the PS5 Pro's GPU is going to have anything to do with it. The CPU is still the limiting factor on whether games can hit 120 FPS, and the new console doesn't appear to be receiving a substantial upgrade in that area. I don't think many games will find themselves newly unshackled by a 10% optional clock speed bump, so the only way I can see games offering high refresh modes is if Sony have some kind of frame generation in the works. And on that bombshell, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.